Every empire swears its money is safe. Every government insists its promises will last forever. And every time, history proves them wrong. From Rome to France, from the Confederacy to modern Lebanon, people have woken up to find their savings worthless, their salaries meaningless, and their futures stolen by systems they thought were solid. Collapse isn't rare. Collapse is the rule. The real question isn't whether financial systems fail. It's how you protect yourself when they do. The illusion of permanence is the most dangerous financial mistake of all. We look at our bank balances, our national currencies, and we assume they are bedrock. But money is not bedrock. It is trust, and trust can vanish overnight. That's why history is so brutal and so useful. Every collapse leaves behind a trail of lessons, patterns, and warnings about what actually protects wealth and what evaporates into dust. And if you pay attention, you'll see that the survivors of these disasters weren't the ones who trusted most. They were the ones who doubted first. Take the Byzantine Empire, often remembered as the eastern half of Rome that somehow survived 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell. At the heart of its economy was the gold, solidus, a coin so reliable that merchants across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia accepted it without question. For centuries, it was the closest thing the medieval world had to a global reserve currency. You would think they learned from Rome's disaster with the denarius, which emperors debased until it was barely silver at all. But centuries later, the Byzantines made the same mistake in gold. They began shaving purity, stretching the metal thinner, mixing in cheaper alloys. At first, no one noticed. Then trust cracked. The coin that had anchored Mediterranean trade became just another political fiction. Debasement destroyed its credibility, and with it, the Byzantine economy lost the stability it had enjoyed for generations. What survived? Not paper promises. Merchants who hoarded real gold or land outside. The empire preserved wealth while everyone else watched their savings evaporate. That's the first timeless lesson. Governments cannot resist diluting their money, and when they do, value flees to assets they cannot counterfeit. But collapses don't always come from rulers tampering with coins. Sometimes they come from shocks no one sees coming. In the mid-14th century, Europe was struck by the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in its history. Between 1347 and 1351, as many as half of all Europeans died. Cities emptied, villages disappeared, trade routes crumbled. And yet the economic story of the plague is more complex than simple destruction. When half the labor force vanishes, labor becomes precious. Survivors could demand higher wages. Food and land became abundant compared to people. Families with silver, goods, or even just the ability to work suddenly had leverage they'd know. What Florence experienced in the 1300s would repeat centuries later. In 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed in days, dragging the global economy down with it. In 2019, Lebanese banks froze accounts overnight. In every era, the pattern is identical. When institutions fail, they do not fall alone. They take the savings of ordinary people with them. The survivors are always the ones who understand that the promises of powerful institutions are only good until the moment they aren't. The American Civil War is remembered for battles and politics, but behind it was a financial disaster few Americans today understand. War demanded money, and both the Union and Confederacy printed enormous quantities of paper currency. In the North came greenbacks, not backed by gold, but by trust in the U.S. government. The more they printed, the less each note bought. Inflation crept upward. But the South faced a far darker fate. The Confederacy printed greybacks in staggering quantities until inflation reached thousands of percent. Soldiers' pay became worthless before they could spend it. Families carried bags of bills to buy a loaf of bread. By 1865, Confederate money had died. What mattered wasn't patriotic paper, but real goods, land, food, metal, anything tangible. Lifelong savings turned to dust, and those with access to hard assets bought property for pennies. Most Americans never hear this part of history, but they should. The U.S. has already lived through a currency collapse, and protection came only from holding assets the system couldn't inflate away. France repeated the same mistake during its revolution. The government printed assignats, paper backed by confiscated church land. At first, they seemed like a brilliant solution. But the printing didn't stop. Each new issue diluted the last. Prices spiraled. Farmers refused to sell food for paper. Bread riots erupted. The revolution devoured itself. The winners weren't idealists holding patriotic notes. They were people with food, silver, or property. Trust broke and the currency vanished. Fast forward to 1997. Southeast Asia collapsed under the weight of foreign debt. Thailand's currency peg snapped, debts became unpayable, and panic spread through Indonesia, Malaysia, and South Korea. Ordinary people suffered as savings lost value and jobs evaporated. Hedge funds and foreign institutions bought assets at fire sale prices. The lesson was brutal. Debt in someone else's currency is a death trap. When the storm hits, the debtor drowns, not the lender. If all of this sounds distant, look closer. In Lebanon between 2019 and 2021, banks locked their doors. Deposits were frozen. The currency lost over 90% of its value. Doctors, engineers, retirees, and entire generations on this were wiped out. Money in the bank turned out not to be a treasure chest but a loan to institutions that decided not to repay. The people who